Welcome to yet another webinar with Smart Cities Connect on 6 principles for preparing your organization and team for using AI responsibly. We're thrilled to have you today. I am Michael Suarez. I'm the Associate Editor with Smart Cities Connect. It's a brand of Tech Connect. Before we dive into the webinar, I quickly want to run through some of the housekeeping rules for the webinar. Firstly, we have a great panel of speakers who bring a wealth of knowledge and expertise. So we're excited that they're going to be sharing that valuable insight with you all today. In order to have a smooth presentation, we encourage the audience to have everybody, it's going to be on mute, and then followed by the presentation, the fire chat style format. We will open up the floor to questions, Q&A, and so we encourage you all to feel free to submit any questions with the feature on your panel there. So uh, excited about that as well too. So please, we encourage you with any questions you might have for today's speakers. Without further ado, today we have two speakers from SAS Intel. We have Jennifer Robinson, Global Public Sector Strategic Advisor, as well as Sterlina Smith, Senior Manager of Data Ethic Practice, discussing the 6 principles for preparing your organization and team for using AI responsibly. And with that, I will pass it over to Jennifer.
Great. Thank you so much, Michael. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. We've all heard or read stories about unintended negative outcomes of algorithms. And these have many people weighing the value of AI against the risks. I work for SAS, which was founded in 1976 as one of the first AI and analytics companies. Having decades of AI work, SAS is committed to creating technology that's ethical, equitable, and sustainable for individuals and societies. We have a commitment to be responsible in our innovation. Because of ethical concerns that arise at any point in the analytics lifecycle, responsible innovation considers the entire innovation process. A responsible innovation approach injects equity and fairness at every step, from idea to development to deployment. We're talking about identifying bias in data and algorithms, improving the value and quality of data, building confidence in the fairness of models, and meeting requirements of regulations and policies that governments are setting all over the globe. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get started in talking about these 6 principles of responsible AI. And I'm sure that you've been hearing a lot about responsible AI or trustworthy AI because a lot of people are talking about it. But what we'd like to do here is step through each of these and talk about how it's not just talk about them in concept, but talk about how they can be adopted in practice. And as Michael said, I'm the Global Public Sector Strategic Advisor at SAS. I have a long history in working in data, having gotten started working in financial systems for the federal government, US federal government, in the 1980s. And I've worked in local government for 25 years. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Sterlina to introduce herself.
Well, thank you. I am Sterlina Smith, and I'm a senior leader in the data ethics practice at SAS. And even though I went to school for communications and then subsequently for law, I found myself at SAS for almost 24 years. And I'm fortunate to be doing something that I love, guiding our thought leadership around AI ethics, as well as leading our data for good efforts. And a lot of people say, well, what is a data ethics practice? That's the team that I'm part of that's housed in R&D, and we're supported by the C-suite across SAS. And we're really the cornerstone of the responsible innovation efforts at the company. So we're a diverse team. We're made up of program managers and developers and data scientists and the loan attorney with a wide variety of tenure across the company and experience, both work and lived, that we bring to our roles. And we're really key to the AI governance efforts at SAS. And I want to touch on responsible innovation that Jennifer mentioned and what that actually means. And at SAS, that's really our umbrella term for our commitment to working with customers and partners and academia to increase the awareness of and also the necessity for technology that's ethical, equitable, and sustainable for both individuals and society. And Responsible innovation includes trustworthy AI, which is really when you have an AI system that's been designed and developed and deployed with human centricity in mind. And today, as Jennifer said, we're going to talk about these principles, these 6 words that you see on the screen now. And when you look at them, they're words that you know. There's nothing necessarily novel about the words themselves. But what's important and important to us and what makes them special is the meaning that's been shaped by our company culture and what we've assigned to each one and why they're important to us as an organization. And they ensure that SaaS technology is developed and used responsibly. And so by adhering to these principles, the 6 that you see here, that helps us promote ethical innovation and build trust with our users and really contribute to a positive societal impact. And they help us navigate issues sometimes, ethical dilemmas, and help manage some tensions to make sure that we are using technology in the most productive and least harmful way feasible. And I'm excited to be here with you all today.
Great. Thank you, Sterlina. So as Sterlina just mentioned, SAS data ethics team has identified these 6 key principles that you see on the screen here. And we're going to talk about each one of these with the hope that you find them useful to help you protect your organization, your employees, and the people that you serve. So let's go ahead and get started, Sterlina, by talking about human centricity. People fear AI overstepping its role in performing tasks typically performed by humans. The idea that a computer is making decisions that affect the lives and well being of people and our planet can be really worrisome to people. In terms of AI, what does human centricity mean?
Mm-hmm. Well, here you see that it says we're talking about promoting human well-being and agency and equity. And what does that really mean? Technology doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's linked to society and the world around us. And one of those things can influence the other in sometimes ways that we expect, and then sometimes in ways that we didn't plan on. And it's the understanding of this that really drives that primary principle of human centricity, where we're looking at data driven systems and how they should be designed so that they're both promoting and preserving human dignity, agency, equity, and that overall well being. And when we think about human agency specifically, that's really a priority. And so, what we mean by that, it's the crucial ability for an individual person to maintain control over the design, the development, the deployment, and the use of AI systems that have an impact on their lives. And this is where we really see humans in the loop. And this is a concept that you'll hear several times today. It'll come up throughout the principles. But what we mean when we're talking about humans in the loop is really that collaboration between humans and AI, where we're maintaining that control that I mentioned. And I think we can all say that, machines are great, but people are great too. And when we put those two things together and work together, we have better outcomes and we're better together. So we advocate for human in the loop.
Yeah, and we talk about, like, when we talk about human in the loop, we're talking about humans overseeing what data is fed into a system, managing the model to make sure that it's not drifting, that it's producing accurate results, and then qualifying the output, right?
Mhm.
So one of the we listed here some questions that people watching this might want to ask about their use of AI, and are they keeping human centricity at the as a focus? Excuse me. And one of the questions there says, who might be harmed by the use of this system? I think that's a really intriguing question,
Mhm.
because we want to make sure that we don't have people harmed. Um, so let's talk a little bit more about the importance of identifying potential
Mhm.
inequity. What does an organization do to accomplish this? Like, how can that be done?
Right. And something to bring up is something we do in our group all the time. It's our little phrase. And we ask ourselves, not just could we, but should we? And I
Mhm.
find that I even say this to my child. I have a 15-year-old, and I say, well, just because you could doesn't mean you should. Right. And so we think about that and we think about 3 things. We think about for what purpose, to what end, and for whom might this fail? And that goes to that question of who might be harmed by the use of this system. Who could this fail? And so we try and be proactive in really finding the potential for inequities. And we look at diverse and inclusive populations. but we really focus on vulnerable populations, recognizing that if we can safeguard those most vulnerable populations, we're probably doing okay for everybody else, and we're really benefiting society as a whole. And I think it's important too to really understand an AI system's purpose, because what that's going to do is that's going to help you really hone in on the target populations. And so when you have this understanding of the population that you're trying to reach or benefit or help, and you're thinking about for whom might this fail, you're able to reduce some bias, which we know is the big thing, because you can make sure that AI systems are built on data that's really representative of the population. Something else is automated data exploration, and that is going to help you really be able to kind of look at distributions of variables in both the training data that you're using, and relationships between the variables before models are in production. And then organizations should also really be aware too, when models are in production, that they need to be reviewed for potential differences in the performance for different groups. Are they behaving, the models behaving as expected, or the same way for different groups? And any bias should really be assessed and reported. And if there are kind of groups that are at risk that are identified, at that point, AI developers can really take targeted steps to try and foster that fairness. We also think too about data literacy. I know we talk about AI literacy, but there's also data literacy. So we're talking about the ability to read and write and communicate data in context. And since AI is being used increasingly to really make decisions that are affecting our lives, it really becomes essential that individuals have that data literacy as well. So that's what we're talking about there.
Okay, awesome. And this really, everything that you're just talking about goes hand in hand with the next principle, which is inclusivity. You were talking about keeping the people in mind that the system is for, and that's really what inclusivity is about. It's really looking at ensuring accessibility and integration of diverse perspectives throughout the AI and analytics lifecycle. And that really begins with the data, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Um, a lack of inclusivity in a solution can cause unintended consequences. And as I said, it really begins with that data. So let's talk a little bit about algorithmic bias. That can occur when data used to train an AI system reflects societal biases. And you think that because you're using AI, it's not including any bias because it's a machine. It doesn't have my inherent biases, but you can actually infuse discrimination in just through your data. We've heard examples of like facial recognition algorithms that have misidentified people of color. We've heard about HR systems that show bias against women. And then there is confirmation bias, in which AI selectively presents information that aligns with the user's existing beliefs. Now, I think that's really funny. If you're searching, you're constantly stopping and watching little videos, you'll get more of those kind of videos because you have that confirmation bias shows up in the algorithms. When these biases are embedded in AI solutions, people are not being served fairly by the system, and stereotypes are reinforced and disparities are deepened. So, how can we make sure that inclusivity is infused throughout the AI lifecycle?
It's funny you talk about bias and confirmation bias, and think about when you go to buy a car and you decide on the one that you want, and then you start to see that everywhere. And there were probably the same number of those cars on the road to start with, but you just weren't paying attention for it. You weren't looking for it. You weren't trying to, in some ways, validate the choice you had made. And so I kind of think about that when I think about confirmation bias. But there are so many different types of bias that can come in the we call the data chain of custody, right? So from the time you get data and you're getting it to be able to do something with it, to then actually doing something with it, to then presenting it out in a way that people can consume it as well. There are times where bias can kind of creep into any of those stages of that data chain of custody. And so inclusivity really is about ensuring accessibility and including those diverse perspectives and experiences. And what we see with data-driven systems is they've got the potential to amplify societal bias and barriers at scale, and really highlight power imbalances and solidify the marginalization of vulnerable populations. And with data, you always hear the term, garbage in, garbage out, right? And that's true. So we need to take intentional measures to ensure that the data-driven systems are built so that the resulting benefits in the insights actually serve all the members of the community. And we need to make sure that these systems are also accessible, that they reflect diverse perspectives and experiences, and that inclusivity should show up throughout. It should show up in the design of the system, in the development, in the deployment of it, as well as in the decision making. And when we have that lack of inclusivity, it goes to the things that you mentioned when you talked about the facial recognition algorithms, having issues, and HR, and times where we'll see negative words associated with women more frequently than men. And it's these types of things that, when they're embedded and they're unmitigated, that those reinforce those harmful stereotypes and really deepen the disparities and make things worse. But all is not lost. There are things we can do to work toward inclusivity. And one of those things is to really ensure comprehensive data representation. So, for example, when you are training an AI model to predict whether someone's going to be approved for a loan, right, you'd want to make sure that the data set that you use includes people from diverse backgrounds and income levels. Something else is prioritizing all communities equally. And so once you've got a model developed, you need to make sure that you're reviewing that for potential differences in that model performance for different groups. How is it working for different groups? Particularly when you have specified like sensitive variables. And if bias is found, it needs to be addressed and reported for that model performance, and looking at things for accuracy and predictions. So we need to both detect the bias, but then we also need to mitigate that. I think the last thing would really be just designing products with everyone in mind. And so inclusive innovation really goes beyond looking at data representation and bias mitigation. It really needs participation from all people in diverse backgrounds throughout the development process, so that we can create AI systems that both empower and serve the needs of the community members. Here we're talking about intuitive user interfaces, and think about like language compatibility for technologies. At SAS, we actually have a team that focuses on this. So those are some things I would say.
Great. And these human centricity, inclusivity go again hand in hand. I mean, there's so much overlap between these. So
Really
let's go
is.
on to the next one, which is accountability. When we talk about accountability between people, right? It means, hey, I'm gonna you can trust me to do what I say I'm going to do, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's very similar with our systems. Accountability, when we talk about AI, is proactively identifying and mitigating adverse impacts created by the AI models. Um, so we're talking about being accountable for our actions and our decisions, and having a trust built in that model so that people know that when that model runs, they believe that the outcomes are valid and worthwhile. So let's talk a little bit about accountability and how that can be infused into your AI work.
Mm-hmm. Accountability really is a shared responsibility of all the people that are interfacing with the data-driven system, whether we're going from the collection side we talked about, where we're getting data ready, to actually doing the analytics, and then to the decision making. And so anyone that's on that spectrum really of responsibility needs to understand the role that they play, their specific role, and help proactively mitigate and remediate any adverse impacts of decisions that come, from that system. And you said trust, and trust is something that I talk about often. And sometimes, I might have come in today and said, do you trust me? How many of you actually trust me? And, if I could see you all, hopefully a lot of you would have raised your hand. But why would you have done that? Did you automatically trust me because I'm here and brought to you by credible groups? Like, kind of what's behind that? But I think trust is one of those things that's really central to all relationships. It's the foundation for our personal and our professional relationships. And when you think of accountability and trust, they can kind of be two sides of the same coin, if you will, because trust can be fueled by actions that showcase our accountability, right? If I take responsibility for my role in something, and then you're more likely to trust me, right? So I think when people hold themselves accountable for their actions and decisions, that trust really increases. And trust in AI, that comes up a lot. It raises questions around the level of trust that someone has in an AI system, and I think that's often influenced by both their awareness and their understanding. And it's important that users and developers and deployers of AI really think about the ways that they can embed accountability into AI systems to help foster that trust, and again, make it a shared responsibility. One way you can do that is developing clear decision workflows. So assigning ownership and adding that level of transparency to an AI system. And when you can see a workflow where you can see who did what, basically, right? So who created something, who approved it, who made an annotation to it, who deployed something, anywhere kind of along the way, when you can see that trail of who was involved, that is really helpful. And it's this intentional oversight that can help build accountability in these various decision checkpoints and allow organizations to understand and mitigate risks proactively. And again, we're talking about humans in the loop, right? So we come back to that. That seems to be a theme throughout as well.
Yeah, and that first question there, how are outcomes monitored and can they be overridden and corrected? I think it's so important, as you mentioned, to have these mechanisms in place so that there are people who are responsible and they have a, a planned course of action if something were to go wrong. But talk to me a little bit more about how those outcomes are monitored and how what that looks like to have people who are being able to override and correct when they see those models not performing correctly.
Right. Having a plan is in place, right? Having a plan in place is important for a lot of things. And really observing and being able to audit AI and analytic workflows will ensure that an organization is alerted to any issues as soon as possible so that they can then respond to it. And so, quick response to an issue is going to allow an organization to really mitigate concerns before they escalate, right? We want to get it before it gets worse, right? Um, and when we look at feedback loops, implementing those can be important because that helps AI systems learn and adjust their behavior. But something else is you also need to look out for the unexpected. And you may say, well, how am I supposed to know what I don't know? How do I look out for something that I'm not anticipating? But that's really like to effectively identify and address adverse impacts in advance. Just it goes back to that continuous monitoring of the AI systems being really important. And that can really happen through performance monitoring. So here we're talking about, keeping an eye on the various aspects of AI system performance, such as data drifts and concept drifts and out of bounds and all these other metrics. And I think about like being in a kitchen, right? And I'm making dinner and I have, something in the oven, but then I have something on the stove, but then I need to chop something else. And, at the end of the day, it's all hopefully going to result in dinner that's on a plate. But there are a lot of different things that need to kind of come together and need to be watched. And, if the stove is bubbling over, then I need to do something to kind of fix that. And I know that seems so simple, but it's about being aware, having that awareness, having that monitoring in place, and kind of keeping your eye on things to catch things before they get too bad. They can really help, like if you have these monitoring mechanisms, they can really help to build the right level of accountability. You can loop in the appropriate people when you need to and measures to really help fix unexpected behaviors of AI systems. And so when we do this, it goes back to trust. Again, a theme we'll see throughout is it really helps to foster that trust between individual users and society, really creating that robust foundation for responsible AI innovation.
Yeah, and I think it's really important for people to set their expectations. For those who haven't worked with AI, to set their expectation that you don't just set a model going and be like, "So long, model. Good luck." You're tending to it like you
Mhm.
would anything else. So that's great. Let's go on to transparency and talk about that. Public sector organizations have a transparency mandate that is unlike anything experienced in the private sector. In fact, the drive for transparency is one of the aspects of AI that is so frustrating for citizens. They believe that governments should not have these black box systems. And for many people to trust the output of a system, they want their government to be able to explain how the system derived its conclusions or produced its output. So let's talk about transparency, that ability to explain and instruct on the usage openly.
Oh, it just gave me a little chuckle when you said that. It made me think about showing your work, right,
Yeah.
in math. Again, go back to this child of mine that doesn't like to show his work because he says, "Well, I just know the answer. I know how I got it." And I'm like, "That's great, but that's not following instructions, and you need to show your work. You need transparency in how you got there, right? How do they know you didn't, get that answer from someone else, kind of thing." So, transparency really means that we're able to both explain and instruct on that usage openly. And we're talking about potential risks and we're helping people understand how decisions are made. And so this goes back to trust, right? And so for people to trust a system, they need to know when and why these systems are being used and what the expectations are that they can have and how it will affect them. And we really need clear, explainable communication. And since transparency really helps people understand how decisions are made, organizations would benefit from communicating models' intended scope and outcomes and really identifying kind of potential bias and fostering user trust. Of course, this is in addition to any legal requirements that you have to meet, right, which are some in place and continuing to come. To achieve like this transparency, you've got some tools in your tool chest, right? You could consider model cards, data lineage, model explainability. There's natural language processing, right? All these strategies kind of help users understand what use cases are appropriate for the model and then which things might be more concerning. And so when you can understand kind of the source and the context and the data that was used to train a model, it helps understand any limitations that might be embedded into a system and maybe assumptions that are introduced as well during that during the data chain of custody. So again, that get do show, right? If you think about data chain of custody that way, but really building transparency mechanisms also gives users an understanding of possible adverse impacts of decisions made by them. And something to think about is really like, can humans explain the responses from tools? And do people understand that they're interacting with a data-driven system, right? Do you always know when you're interacting, with a chatbot, for instance? It's also important to know the source and really understand data lineage so there can be this transparent view of how an organization is going to store and process and analyze data. And that's going to help understand suitability of systems for different use cases as well. And organizations can really better understand the data assets that they have and which ones are going to be relevant, which ones are going to be appropriate for different uses, and how they should really document the inputs and outputs of that. And then, of course, there's model explainability, which at the end of the day is really just helping a user understand how does the model work and how was this decision made. It's being as transparent as possible.
So let's look at some of the questions that organizations might want to be talking about and asking themselves if they are worried about transparency. Given that government organizations have been collecting data for decades, I wonder how feasible it is for citizens to know how their data is being used and shared. That one's pretty intriguing to me. Sterlina, do you have an example of that in practice that we can talk about?
I can tell you that the complexity of models can make it definitely challenging for anyone involved to understand how decisions are made and what factors were considered. And while it's not a model, I can't tell you how many times, even last night, that I've read something and I've been like, what? Wait, what does that say? And I've gone back to read it again to try and understand what is it saying. And I'm an attorney, right? So that's saying a lot. Um, but to help with this, again, we talked about natural language processing and that really being a good tool to help explain the models. And what that can do is it can generate text explanations for these data different data-driven decisions as the decisions are made. And so it's a good idea for an organization to come up with descriptions that make sense for the data models that are written in simple language, something that almost anyone could understand, right? Like think like what is the simplest way that you could communicate what you're trying to get across, and to make sure that it can be understood by any audience, through that. So this means that the stakeholders and any impacted community members as well could really interpret and understand the results of the systems, and they wouldn't need, a background in data science or in computer programming to be able to understand the output of the model and what it means. But just putting it in simple words. Oftentimes I'll write something and then I'm like, that's too complicated. Let me go back and change that and make it easier for people to understand. So it really kind of comes back to that as well.
Awesome. All right. Well, having worked in government for a while, I am very familiar with this struggle that governments deal with, and what we're talking about with transparency is an extension of this. That struggle between balancing transparency with the need to protect privacy and security. And like transparency, the responsibility to protect privacy and security is something that governments have been focused on for ages. For many governments, existing privacy regulations overlap with AI regulations that they've been adopting or they have in the works. So many AI regulations are being built upon these privacy frameworks because organizations see parallels between keeping data secure and keeping AI models well governed. So let's talk about what governments are doing to keep their data private and secure.
Right. So, in addition to meeting the regulatory requirements for data protection, you also really need to respect the use and application of the data about an individual or a population of people. And so, when an organization is really kind of going strong with AI, either getting going or going strong, we'll say embracing it, you often get large volumes of data that really are powering these systems. And so, it is important to handle that data appropriately. And we are talking about, making sure we have adequate privacy policies and security measures to protect it. And so we're trying to prevent accidental exposure and really ensure ethical data use. And AI technology is often using sensitive data. So that's for creating and training and utilizing the models. And the data can have private information about people. It could have sensitive business use cases in there. It could have healthcare data, lots of different types of data that you may not want just the general public to have. And so unauthorized access or if we inappropriately disclose that type of data can really cause harm to both individuals and organizations as well. And in response to that, governments have expanded privacy and security laws, which really protect individual data subjects' privacy and also set up guardrails to help minimize the sensitive data exposure and deal with data breaches as well. And something that we see that a lot of organizations do, a lot of governments do, is data masking as well, being one way to do that. And so when we talk about data masking, think about you're at a party, right? And you're putting on a mask and you're trying to hide your face or to you're still you, right, with that mask on, but you look a little different. And so with data masking, the technique is used to really protect sensitive information. So we're gonna randomize, we're gonna substitute, we're gonna reshuffle, we're gonna do something with that original data with similar value. So we're hiding its value, really ensuring that the data remains usable for testing, for development, for training, but we're also minimizing the risk of exposing sensitive information. And so it can protect things like, addresses or names or social security numbers or any intellectual property or financial information and all kinds of other sensitive information. So data masking is one way to really do that.
Yeah, and you just mentioned using masked data for training and testing models. I think a lot of times when we think about masking data, we're thinking about when we publish the data, when we publish information out for our citizens. But even just in testing and training models, it's important to be careful about your data. And we talked earlier about some of the risks that are involved when we use sensitive data. So one thing that I'm really excited about are these tools that have been developed that create synthetic data. And synthetic data reproduces the same statistical properties, probabilities, patterns, and characteristics of real world data, but it's been trained on that real world data. So now I can run my models, test them out, look for how accurate they're being, and so forth, but I'm not using real data. And that enables me to protect any personally identifiable information of my citizens or any secure data that my government might hold. Um, and it eliminates some of that exposure that has been inherent in running AI models.
Yeah, that's true. And to go back to the data masking thing, I mentioned that I'm responsible for the Data for Good projects that SAS has. And so when we're doing those projects, we don't take any information or any data that has personally identifiable information in it. And so data masking becomes important not just in data that's being presented out to someone, but in data that we're taking in before we even do the analysis on it. It goes back to that privacy and security and protection of that data. But yeah, about synthetic data, I think that's a great idea, and that's something that I am excited to kind of see grow as well. But something else to consider is also called authorization management, right? And what that really means is basically who needs to know. So not everyone, have you ever been told, well, you don't need that's information you don't need to know, right? So not everyone needs the same level of access when we're working with data and when we're kind of seeking these data-driven insights. In a lot of cases, only select data scientists in your organization really need access to that full data set to find the most relevant and, we'll say, enlightening insights. And these insights can then be shared with different employees who have a need to know without disclosing that underlying sensitive data. And so authorization management really gets down to, does this person need to see this, or do they just, I'm sorry, does this person need to see the data, to be clear, or do they just need to see the insights from it? And a good authorization management practice would be to apply, say, a least privileges model that's going to grant each role the minimum access required to complete the task they have on hand. And similarly, you can set up user groups to manage appropriate rights and help restrict data usage on that need-to-know basis, really ensuring that people with a legitimate need are the only ones that can really access sensitive information. And in doing something like that, organizations can improve, we'll say, data hygiene and really protect sensitive information from those with unauthorized access or disclosure.
Yeah, and that's so important, especially when we're seeing this rise of cyber attacks going on, right? And it's
Mm-hmm.
not just this rise of the number of cyber attacks, but the maturation of the cyber attack, um, techniques with AI. It's just absolutely incredible because they're now really believable cyber attacks, and it's hard for people to be able to parse out what's real and what's not. And I've heard people talk about the fact that AI regulations may make law abiding citizens and organizations more vulnerable to cyber attacks because they're abiding by the new regulations, but bad actors aren't. And among these privacy and security questions that we have listed, one of the questions is how might cyber or adversarial attacks exploit this solution? And that's a really important question to be asking.
It is. And, we do need to try and safeguard against external attacks for sure. And, we talked a second ago about data masking and authorization management and how that can provide privacy to the data we have when data is used within an organization. But we can't overlook these external forces that are there and these adverse influences. And so, as you said, organizations are increasingly exposed to malicious attacks, which really is, again, underscoring the need for a private and secure environment. Because what can happen is with these, adversarial attacks, it can really muddy the data and introduce things like incorrect variables in machine learning models. It can fool models with deceptive data or labeling or give incomplete or inaccurate data points, which can then cause, extensive harm. And so one of the things that can really be done to kind of combat this is to help mitigate the external attacks using adversarial training by detecting and cleaning those inputs, implementing privacy in the training data, and really monitoring input variables that exhibit substantial distribution shifts so that you can help defend against attacks and dare I say it, humans in the loop again, right? Making sure that we're not just leaving things to run on their own, but that there are people, looking and monitoring. And as we continue to talk, I hope you've all kind of realized that these principles are all connected, and one's not necessarily more important than the other, but there is a lot of overlap between them, and a lot of themes that run through them as well. So,
Yeah, they really are. And as I'm listening to what you're saying, I'm thinking about how much vulnerability we have with generative AI for that infusion of false information, because it's a lot of large language models are running off of the open internet. And so anyone can pervert the data source, right, with bad information. So it really is something that is critically important for humans to stay in the loop, that we're qualifying what the output is and saying, is this accurate? Could this really be true? And verifying, where that might have come from. Let's
mhm.
go ahead and talk about our last of 6 principles, robustness. Robustness is having our AI models operate reliably and safely. In other words, operating consistently and producing the results that we can count on. So we were just talking about human in the loop and making sure that we're accountable by deploying mechanisms for customer feedback and error remediation and correction. So let's talk about these other aspects besides human in the loop and accountability that make our AI robust.
Yeah, data-driven systems really have to produce consistent and accurate results and have a clear guideline for safe operation. So they need to be tested against a range of inputs and different real-world scenarios to try and help reduce those unforeseen harms. And so if conditions don't support accurate and consistent output, if that's what you're seeing, then safeguards need to be put in place to minimize the potential for harm. So it's kind of like the same way you expect your car to work, right? Or your email to function as you've set it up, or different technologies that you've come to rely on. You have an expectation for how that will work. We have an expectation that our AI models are going to operate reliably and safely as well. And if we have an AI system that's just going to change willy-nilly, right? Like just it doesn't matter. Sun's out, sun's not out. I'll change the way I work, right? That would be useless to most organizations. And so if issues occur, we need to have ways that really help us assess and manage potential risks. And I know we've beat human in the loop here, but I want to reiterate just the importance of that again. And also we can't forget about workflow management tools that can really help establish those automated guardrails when we're talking about AI models, and looking at and showing the history and the tracking and ensuring that future changes are made with consultation or approval from subject matter experts. Like, again, goes back to that who's doing what, as well as really continuous monitoring of performance. And again, these are things we've talked about with other principles as well, but they apply with robustness as well. There's also model validation and auditing against like different inputs to make sure that systems can accommodate change, and you're looking for things like model decay and model drift, and how are models performing over time, and when is it time to retire those models? When are they no longer producing accurate results? And one way to test these models is with model pipelines that can allow a user to run the model under different ranges of inputs, and look at how does it perform under different conditions. And then in doing that, they're able to select the best model, the most effective model. So you'll hear that referred to as a champion model. And once that's been selected, then an organization can continue to validate that model and identify when it begins drifting from an ideal state. So we're looking again with robustness, as it says, to, are we operating reliably? Are we getting consistent outputs? Is it happening safely? And are we able to manage that risk throughout a system's life cycle? This isn't saying that something's not going to go awry at some point, right? But do we have a way to manage that risk and to take action when needed to remediate that?
And Sterling, you're seeing models that are performing that optimization, that selection of the champion model
Mhm,
autonomously, right? So
mhm, mhm,
it's going through, and then you have the human in the loop at the end, kind of saying, yeah, that is accurate. That is the most accurate.
mhm.
Among our questions that we have here, One of them has to do with what happens when the system goes awry. You mentioned that just a second ago, when
Hmm.
systems go
Hmm.
awry. What should be the response when that happens?
Right, and that goes back to having those safeguards and having those alerts, so we know that in fact something has gone awry, so that we know when we might be experiencing an adversarial attack,
Mhm.
from an external source. Because again, they're designed to really fool AI systems by making these small, little,
Mhm.
imperceptible input changes.
Yeah.
And a way to mitigate that is really, again, it goes back to that training which we talked about a few minutes ago. But when you've got a system that really only functions under ideal conditions, it's like my dogs that will only go out when it's not raining, right?
Mhm.
That's not very useful. Models need to be able to scale and adapt to changes, and so a system's robustness really depends on an organization's ability to both validate and audit the outcomes on various inputs, to have a fail-safe for unexpected behaviors, and again, the human in the loop design. And so when you take these steps, it really helps ensure that these data-driven systems are operating both reliably and safely and minimizing potential risk. Again, it's about minimizing the risk. I don't think you're going to completely eliminate it.
I guess this kind of goes along with resiliency then, because yes,
Mhm.
as we adopt more and more models, our government's going to be dependent on them. Our citizens will expect to have certain autonomous, real-time insights and so forth. So we're expecting that as we're identifying the sanctity of those models, we also have a method to approach this so that if something goes sideways, the system can go back up and running quickly rather than being down, for a long period of time. Let's go ahead and see if there are any questions that people might have pertaining to any of these 6 principles that we've talked about today. We have a little bit of time to field questions if they exist.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Jennifer and Serlina, for those valuable insights on the six principles that you just discussed. Yes, we encourage the audience members to submit any questions that you all might have for Jennifer and Sterlina. We'll go ahead and start off with this first question. How does an organization take AI from pilot to practice in risk adverse organizations?
Oh, well, think about why you're doing it, right? What did we say? What did we say in the beginning? Not just could we, but should we? Um, for what purpose, to what end, and for whom might this fail? Why are you doing it? Are you pursuing this AI endeavor because you don't want to be left out, or are you doing it because it makes the most sense for your organization? And then also thinking about, start small, but you don't have to kind of conquer the world in the beginning, but like do something, do something small and see success, and then continue to build on that. Also, think about, how we have these principles here, and I talked about the fact that they're not words that you've never heard before, but how it's the culture of SaaS that shaped the meaning of these and how we put them into practice. Think about the culture of your organization and what's important to you all, and why you're going down this path. And remember that, AI governance moves at the speed of culture, right? So if your organization is not prepared to, know, embrace this technology and this path you're going down, it's not going to be really successful. So think about that. And I guess something else to think about is, when it comes to like AI governance, people are like, oh my gosh, where do we start? What do we do? And I'm like, well, let's not recreate the wheel. Think about the things that you already have that work well. Do you have a data governance strategy that's great for you? And if you do, then figure out what works well from that and take that and say, all right, now let's build our AI governance strategy. And so that's what we've done as well. Is we've got basically 4 parts that are part of AI governance. So we have oversight, and that's where we've got a team of people, both data ethics practice as well as stakeholders from across the company. Again, we're looking for those diverse inputs, right? Who are there to kind of help with those tougher choices and those ethical decisions, and making sure we're on the right path. We've got a group of people in what we call controls, which are looking at risk and helping to mitigate those different risks as well, being aware of regulations, and working closely with legal on that, and considering all the different frameworks that are happening. Like we look at the NIST RMF framework and that type of stuff, and kind of looking at that as a great guide. But we have a group that we call Platform, and what they're doing is they're taking these 6 principles that you see here, and they are infusing that into the development of our products so that our principles show up in our products. And then we have a culture group, and sometimes I don't think people put enough emphasis on culture, and they're like, but really, again, it's that culture that shapes meaning. And so we are trying to infuse ethical inquiry across the company and make sure that everyone understands what we as a company, our employees understand what we mean by responsible innovation, how we're talking about it internally, how we're talking about it externally, and kind of going down that path. So I think we might have been a little bit all over the board there, but I think the biggest thing is, why are you doing what you're doing? Don't take on too much to start with. Don't recreate the wheel. Figure out what works and kind of go from there, and then have a plan and execute on the plan.
Absolutely. Thank you. The next question here is, do you have examples of successful AI use cases in government?
Oh yeah, there's a lot of governments already using AI. One early use of AI has been for the detection of fraud, error, or waste. And you think about when is AI valuable? It's valuable for performing extremely complex tasks that you could do if you had all the time in the world, right? And you never got fatigued. It's performing those kind of tasks, but it's also really good at identifying hidden patterns and trends. And that's what makes it so valuable for fraud detection. But it's also used successfully to do anything that requires the understanding of relationships between people, places, events, or things. That's another opportunity that governments are using it. So they're using it for investigations, like law enforcement investigations. One thing that you also want to think about with AI solutions is, where do you have a ton of data? Because a good AI system relies on having copious amounts of data. So you can see it being used in departments that have lots and lots of data, like statistical organizations or assessment offices, where they have so much data. It's a rich material for running AI.
Great. Thank you. The other question we have here is, what are some of the ways or recommendations that we can improve the accuracy when using generative AI?
Okay, well, I think I'll say something and then I'll pass it over to Sterlina for this, but because we've talked about this before, it's really important when you're using generative AI to, first of all, think about the fact that you have to be careful about being cognizant of where the data is coming from for it, right? You need to, as we said before, you need to qualify what that output is and make sure that it's really true. If you ask it a question, go back and double check the results and make sure that it's really true and accurate. One thing that we are seeing is this idea of a multimodal approach. And when we talk about multimodal, we're talking about combining different forms of AI. So if you're using a large language model, pair it up with traditional AI. So what you can do is, let's say you're consuming a lot of feedback that's presented to you by citizens, and you're like, oh, I'm going to run this through a large language model and summarize it. Well, if you use traditional AI first, you can go ahead and use that to bucket all of those inputs by like groups, and then use the large language model to summarize what those groups are. And the advantage there is that you can have a higher level of accuracy, and you can take away what we call our hallucinations, right? Those misstatements that large language models sometimes produce. Mr. Lena, I'll pass it to you for anything else that you'd add about that.
Well, I think with generative AI, I wouldn't have a policy of, well, have at it, right? Just go do what you want to do, right? I think it's important to have a policy around generative AI internally. Make sure that people understand what's an okay way to use it and what's not. Give guidelines around that. Have a way for people to ask questions when they're thinking about using generative AI as well. Like, is this okay? Is this in line with our policy? And even publish externally what your policy is as well, so that people who are interacting with systems that come from you all understand how you, again, the transparency, how you got to where you are. So I think having a policy is important as well. I think also remembering, I think like Jennifer said, not to necessarily take things that are straight Gen I at face value. A lot of people think of AI as just generative AI, not realizing that it has been around for a long time and has foundation in mathematics and statistics. And, then we have neural networks and machine learning and deep learning and all these things that have gotten us to where we are today with generative AI, and that there's a whole nother like generation of this like next gen. And so just really kind of understanding, how we got to where we are, why you're using the tool that you're using. Is it the right tool for the job, right? Um, and let's see what else. I think there's that in the policy. I would kind of stick with those, thinking about the Gen AI stuff as well. Oh, and also you do have an opportunity if you are using Gen AI. Think about if you're using something that's pulling from a curated data source, or if you're using something that is pulling from the vast internet that's out there. Jennifer mentioned at one point about just all the ways that data can be contributed to a system like that. And there are opportunities within different systems, if you'll go and read their privacy policies, to actually like turn off the sharing of your data and that type of stuff. So use the right tools and check out the ones you're using.
Yeah, and I'd add one other thing. Make sure that your employees in your organization are trained on using generative AI, because it's a low entry point, right? It's very easy to go and use generative AI, like large language models or applications that use large language models. But a lot of organizations, people in organizations, say that they're not being trained in it. And Coleman Parks recently ran a survey and asked people in the public sector about how familiar they are with their organizations, policies, and procedures. And only 30, like something like 36 or 37% of them said that they had been trained adequately for using generative AI. So that's an area we want to make sure that if you have folks in your office using generative AI and basing their work on it, that they've been trained.
Those are some really good points. And Jennifer, one of the questions here is similar to training. So it asks, how do you feel about governments providing training data along with model parameters and weights? Something similar to what was discussed about the open source AI from the open source initiative perspective.
Well, open data is really important for governments. It enables, like governments, to be able to test out what they want to do if they don't have enough data themselves. I think about like the Dallas law enforcement open data that's out there that's been used by a lot of different governments to help them train systems before they run it like their data through the system. So I think it's really valuable. However, if you are putting your data out there for general consumption, you have to be cognizant about privacy and security measures. And what Sterlina was talking about earlier about masking data, we have a whole new opportunity in this realm with these tools that can generate synthetic data, because it is basically another level of sophistication. The fact that we can have data that is generated synthetically. It's not real, but it mimics real data with accuracy of like 99% is fantastic. And that's what I would encourage governments to do. If they're going to be putting out their data for open consumption, I would suggest that they should mask it first.
I want to throw one other thing out there, and this is around public data. Just know that when you get data from somewhere, just make sure that you have the right to actually use that data, that the person that has, or the organization that's provided that data has the right to make that data available. Because even though data can be public data, it doesn't mean that it's usable, or to be used by anyone for anything. There are often terms and conditions associated with that data, even though it may be public data. So just putting that out there to check the terms and
Yeah.
conditions before you use
Yeah.
something.
And that actually brings up another point, because a lot of governments operate under sunshine laws. So if you're using a data set, then that's basically open for viewing by anyone who wants to see it. So be cognizant of that as well, that if you have a responsibility, if you're holding data, you have a responsibility to try to protect it. I know, like in my government, we went to our state legislature for authority to not share data about camp participants, because those are minors. and the state legislature gave us that
Hey,
permission to
Jen.
withhold
Sorry,
that.
Jen, not to interrupt, but we have 30
Ah,
seconds left on
sorry.
the webinar. So, but those were really great insights. But I just want to make sure we respect the 2 o'clock time. I want to thank everyone for joining us. Thank you, Jen and Sterlina, or Jennifer and Sterlina, for joining us today. As we conclude, we encourage everyone to stay connected. Feel free to reach out, and then we'll have this on demand for everyone to see next week on our Smart Cities Connect media and research site. So until next time, thank you everyone and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.